So Dr. Darla Deardorff, I'm just going to give you I promise a quick resume. She completed her Ed.D. in Higher Education Administration at North Carolina State University in the US with a focus on international education, following a master's in adult education. She's Executive Director of the Association of International Education Administrators and founding President of the World Council on Intercultural and Global Competence. In addition to her affiliation with Stellenbosch University, she holds several academic appointments, including as Research Fellow at Duke University. She was the former faculty member at Harvard University's Global Education think tank. She has conducted cross-cultural training for universities, companies, and non-profit organizations for over 25 years and has published widely on international education, intercultural competence, and outcomes assessment with over a dozen books and 75 book chapters and articles. She's regularly invited to speak and consult around the world and has advised organizations such as UNESCO, OECD, AFS International, and International Baccalaureate. And colleagues, it's a true pleasure to finally have this opportunity to welcome her here and invite her to make the opening remarks for our chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Good morning to all of you, and good morning to those joining us online as well. We are just so excited that this launch has finally arrived after quite a lot of work to make it happen. And I want to express deep appreciation to colleagues here at Stellenbosch, to Prof. Klopper, to the team who's been working with the chair. We have Sarah, Vanna, and all who helped to make this day possible, this chair possible. And also a thanks to UNESCO colleagues, to Tabui, to colleagues at UNESCO Paris for their guidance and support in this journey of making this chair possible. I have been working with UNESCO for over the last decade, and it's been so exciting to now be able to see how this can all come together in the UNESCO Chair of Intercultural Competences, and super excited about all the possibilities as we launch this and as we move forward. So I wanted to begin that when I'm not at Stellenbosch, I want to acknowledge that I live and work on the ancestral lands of the Shakori, Okanichi, and Catawba peoples, and I give gratitude for the land itself and to the stewards of the land, past, present, and future. And in addition, I want to acknowledge the overlapping histories of the land, and including the past violence and ongoing harm produced by the legacy of racialized slavery and oppression. So during this brief time with you, kind of setting the stage for our day today together with this symposium, I want to give more of the big picture. Tabui, thank you so much for giving the context of the UNESCO chair globally, but also want to kind of look at this more than intercultural competence within the bigger picture globally. And then I'll turn it over to the co-chair, Sarah Howie, who will contextualize it more for Africa as well. And then we're really looking forward to the interventions from our colleagues to follow. So I want to take us back to a point of reflection as we begin, that over the past 3 years, we have all been reminded of the power of human connection as we all experienced isolation, confinement, social distancing, and even fear. We've witnessed the powerful images of frontline workers giving their all, and neighbors in cities and towns across the world connecting from balconies and through window panes. And these images reminded us how much our lives depend on those around us, and how important it is that we renew our efforts in learning how to live together. The pandemic years were an opportunity for us, yes, to reflect upon what matters most, what binds us all together, and what it means to be good neighbors to each other. The pandemic emphasized all the more that we are all in this together. And given that we are in the same boat, it becomes imperative for us to get along together. And that's where intercultural competence comes in. There's been over 60 years worth of scholarly work done on this construct around intercultural competence, which goes by many different names depending on the discipline. And increasingly, there's research also about social emotional learning, emotional intelligence, discussion around empathy and compassion. And this, coupled with conversations around intersectionalities, with justice, with equity, with diversity, belonging, and inclusion, really bring to mind further questions that need more research. And again, that's where this UNESCO chair can play such an important role in delving further into this research and into the capacity building around key questions. For example, what does this interconnectedness really mean, this interdependence? What if we viewed others through the lens of neighbor, both our local and global neighbors? What would change? What does it mean, and what does it really take to get along together as neighbors? And so this shift in our way of thinking around intercultural competence can point to lots of possibilities as we move forward with the UNESCO chair. So looking at the big picture about kind of where we are globally with intercultural competence, there has been work, quite a bit of work at the global level around intercultural competence. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in 2018 measured global competence in 15-year-olds around the world through the PISA test. And in fact, that's how Sarah, Hallie, and I first began working together, was through the OECD with the PISA Global Competence. UNESCO, as you heard from Tapui, has been working on this intercultural dimension, intercultural dialogue for many years. And in particular, through the work of the intercultural dialogue, through the global citizenship education development, and even with UNHCR with refugees. Other organizations, such as Council of Europe, has done quite a bit of work around intercultural competence, including their work around, their latest work around competencies for democratic culture. The question remains, and this is my burning question, what is necessary for us to get along together as humans sharing this planet? That is the burning question that has driven my over a decade of work around this concept. And I want to share with you, since you'll hear a lot about intercultural competence today, kind of a place to bring us to common ground, some different frameworks and definitions around intercultural competence. Just to note that the OECD has their own framework, that you see the Council of Europe one. Michael Byram has done a lot of work on this that's around intercultural communicative competence used in Europe. And then I wanted to share with you this, and we'll unpack this one a bit. This is the first research-based definition around intercultural competence. So let me delve into this a bit further for you. Competence in general is defined as knowledge, skills, and attitudes. That's just a basic definition of competence. And it's centered on the individual. I was curious to know, what are the key attitudes necessary for intercultural competence, necessary for us to get along together? And three key attitudes emerged from the research that I did on this. The first being respect, and that is a cornerstone of UNESCO's work, respect for human beings, for each other, valuing each other as humans. Second is openness, open-mindedness, as being absolutely essential to intercultural competence and to getting along together. And the third is curiosity, of seeking to learn more about each other, wanting to know more about each other. The knowledge piece of it and the skills, I was a bit surprised with what came from this, because it wasn't specific necessarily to intercultural competence, But around knowledge, the cultural self-awareness of understanding our own identities and how we experience and live and see the world becomes absolutely crucial, along with understanding how others experience the world and understanding others' worldviews. The skills, in the end, again, are not super specific to intercultural, but certainly are ones that are key to getting along together, particularly listening. It starts with listening, and listening for understanding, which we don't do often enough as humans. Instead, we tend to listen for response or for judgment, in which case we often focus more on ourselves than on the person speaking. Together, the knowledge, skills, and attitudes necessary for intercultural competence help inform a shift in ourselves in which we become more adaptable, more flexible, that we are able to engage with others through empathy. And as we do so, what we experience is in our interactions across difference is behavior and communication that is both effective and appropriate with each other. And so if you want a short summary definition of intercultural competence, you'll see it here. But as you can see, as we've unpacked this together, it's really quite complex and involves many different facets. But this effectiveness and appropriateness is very important as we interact with each other, because we know whether we've met our goals or not and been effective, but it's only the other who will know whether we've been truly appropriate in how we've behaved and interacted with each other. And the expanded definition of intercultural competence is looking at this behavior and communication across difference, whatever that difference may be. And Tabui mentioned about it's within and between societies. So looking at how we interact with those from different generations, genders, religions, socioeconomic backgrounds, and so on. That's intercultural competence. How do we connect with others? So those elements were all put into two different frameworks. It's hard for any framework to capture reality, but and I realize it's a bit difficult to see this from where you are, but the important point here is that in the end, and this was already mentioned by our two welcoming speakers, that this is a lifelong process, a lifelong journey that we're all on, that there's no point in which any of us can say, yes, I'm interculturally competent. We always have more to learn about each other every day. So you can find more about this here and in other publications. But one of the pieces that emerged from this research that really intrigued me is that there's only one element that the experts I was working with could agree on as being absolutely essential to intercultural competence, and that is to be able to see the world from others' perspectives. So that has become my burning question, is what are others' perspectives on intercultural competence? That led me to have a Fulbright at Nelson Mandela University several years ago in Port Elizabeth, in trying to understand more from South African perspectives what this looks like, to understand from other perspectives in different places around the world. And it's been interesting to see some of what has emerged, and some of you are much more of an expert at this than I am, around the concept of Ubuntu, and understanding that competence may not reside just in the individual, but it's more in the we, in who we are together. In Andean cultures, there are several related concepts, including buen vivir, where it's also looking at our relationships not just with each other, but with all living beings on this planet. And so that takes into account the natural world as well. And so then a question that emerges is, what does this look like if it's more relationship focused and not so individual focused? And hopefully the chair will begin to unpack more of that piece as well. There was a publication from UNESCO in 2013 looking at different regional perspectives on intercultural competence around the world. Some of the themes that emerged from that work and from the colleagues who were involved with that had to do with the importance of respect, the listening, the relationship building emerged as key, and cultural humility, recognizing that we still have so much to learn about each other, and the value of multiple perspectives. From that work, and Tabu already mentioned this a little bit around story circles, member states wanted to have a concrete way to develop intercultural competence. So the last several years I've been working with UNESCO around UNESCO story circles. It's been an amazing journey to work with UNESCO in implementing this around the world in all 5 UNESCO regions and beyond. Yesterday, it was wonderful. Many of you were participating in the Train the Trainers of UNESCO Story Circles, and it's all available in an open access manual in 6 different languages. And the chair will continue to help take this out and, across this country and across the continent in capacity building around a very concrete way of developing intercultural competence. These are some of the photos from the pilots that were done pre-pandemic, including one in Harare, not too far away. So to share with you then, kind of bringing it, that's the global view, looking at it in terms of higher education, which has been where I've done the majority of my work in terms of international higher education. The International Association of Universities puts together a survey, a global survey of what universities are doing regarding international education. And from the most recent one, I was keen to see where does intercultural competence reside with universities around the world, and was glad to see that the top 2 intercultural competence methods, the ways of developing intercultural competence, had to do with focusing on students' international perspectives and focusing on the faculty, on the professors, and how do we support them. Because what we found in some of the research already is that oftentimes students are further along in their intercultural journeys than even the professors. And so looking at how we can support professors becomes very important. Also focusing on the internationalization at home, on the curriculum, and I know colleagues here are doing that at Stellenbosch. Interestingly, that's not been as much of a priority in my region of the world, in North America. But I know a lot of good work has been done here on that. Institutional-wide learning outcomes related to intercultural become very important, and in the Asia-Pacific and Middle East, we see the highest percentage of institutional outcomes related to that. And it's also interesting to see what extracurricular activities help develop intercultural competence. And you'll see there listed some of the more traditional ones in terms of experiences in the local community, very important, buddy or mentor programs, and then also intercultural workshops for skill building for students and for staff. What's important to keep in mind in looking at intercultural competence within higher education, and of course the chair becomes that think tank, that way of working together within higher ed and connecting UNESCO to higher ed, that it's quite complex. It's more than just moving students around the world. It's looking at what can we do for all students, especially those who are not able to travel. It's important as educators to recognize that it's more than just transferring and transmitting knowledge, but it also, as you heard, involves skills and attitudes. And so thinking about what are we doing in that regard beyond the knowledge piece. It's also a way to look at how do we deepen our connections with each other and the natural world, looking at it holistically, which is why I'm so thrilled that one of the themes of this UNESCO chair is looking at the intersections of intercultural competence with climate action as part of that. It's important to recognize it's more than just one reading or one module. It needs to be embedded in institutions, and it's beyond just that one course. I've done a lot of work around assessment, and we found that certainly it's beyond results, that this is a lifelong process, and it's more the focus on process than results, and looking more for the evidence, not necessarily assessment tools. And in the end, each person is in a different place in their intercultural journey, so a one-size-fits-all doesn't necessarily work. Also, in the end, it's more about looking at a whole school approach, so beyond just the curriculum to what are we doing in the co-curriculum, what are we doing within the community, within the infrastructure, facilities, and so on. And so there's a lot that goes into developing an ecosystem around intercultural competence as we look at it within higher education. Some of the questions that we are already discussing and will continue to look at, particularly within the context of the UNESCO chair, have to do with looking at whose perspectives are represented, What about the materials and examples that we're using? Whose voices are missing? Whose knowledge counts? What and who is being privileged? And what are some of the implicit messages being conveyed? So much of the work around intercultural competence to date, the 60 plus years, has come from the global north. So many of those being cited reside in the global north. And I think that's, again, why it's so important to have this UNESCO chair here at Stellenbosch in South Africa, so that we can work with and look at who are the emerging scholars here doing the work around intercultural competence. What are the perspectives here around intercultural competence? As we look at some of the themes that are emerging globally, it'll be interesting to again see how this can be addressed through the chair. We recognize that intercultural competence doesn't just happen. If it does, we'd all be getting along a lot better than what we do. So it's important to be intentional in addressing intercultural competence. Context really matters, as we know. And so looking particularly at the context of intercultural competence here, within South African cultures, within this continent, very important. Understanding the centrality of the learner in this process, how important active engagement is, not just in the classroom, but beyond the classroom. I've already spoken about the limitation of knowledge, and we have to do much more than just the knowledge piece, but also working on the skills and attitudes part. Focusing on that process piece is so important, the multiple perspectives and bringing those in, particularly from marginalized groups and underrepresented voices in the work that's already out there. And then there's a lot, of course, that can be done around assessment and the importance of using multiple methods, multiple perspectives in the assessment of intercultural competence. When we look to some of the trends that we see, increasingly we're seeing conversations around the intersections of intercultural competence with what I like to call JEDI, justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. There's a lot within that can be unpacked further. Focusing on holistic development of intercultural competence. So again, it's not just one course, one workshop, one training, but how do we look at this holistically within the individual? There is an increased use of peer learning and assessment, of peers learning from and with each other. And in a lot of the literature and what we're seeing, not just in intercultural competence, but within higher education in general, is viewing students as partners. This is not something we do to them, but we have a lot to learn from our students. So we look at them as co-creators as we move forward. Considering the use of intercultural competence coaching is increasingly being used, looking at high impact practices such as service learning, getting students more involved in their local communities and learning from groups within that community. In the end, this takes a long-term commitment from institutions and from individuals. This is something that is done over a lifetime. And that we need to continue to look at how do we connect intercultural competence to real-world issues, which again, I'm so thrilled to see the 3 themes and priorities of this chair being around climate action, gender equality, and peace building. Looking more broadly within higher education, and I would love to invite you to think with us through what this means in terms of the chair and intercultural competence research and capacity building. Because as we look at the work that's being done in UNESCO and the Futures of Education report that has come out from UNESCO, the Education 2030 work from OECD, and I've been involved in both of those, and then even some of the reports coming from Harvard. I tried to summarize all those different reports and synthesize what are some of the themes coming out of those different reports. And what we see in those reports has to do with transdisciplinarity, the importance of the lifelong learning, agency of both students and teachers. There's an increased focus around competency-based education, and along with that, micro-credentialing. particularly with the pandemic, and even before the pandemic, there's been this consistent focus around well-being, and the social-emotional learning plays a certainly important part in that, and intercultural competence. Looking beyond traditional places of learning is part of this, and that relevance piece becomes continually important as we look to the future. So taking some of these different themes that are emerging from these various reports and inviting you now to think about what does this mean for the UNESCO Chair of Intercultural Competences within this context. So super excited to continue to go through the day, to hear from the different voices of our Stellenbosch colleagues shortly. With our global partners, you'll hear from a number of different partners working with the chair, and delighted to be joined today by other UNESCO chairs, and really excited to hear what they have to share with us as well. And then in the end, we're hoping that all of you, including those online, will help contribute to kind of where we go from here with the UNESCO chair as we begin this launch. So with that, I will conclude. I wanted to end with a quote, kind of bringing this back to where we started. And this is a quote that has continued to inspire me in this work around intercultural competence. It's a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. when he said, "We must learn to live together. It's not an option. We must learn to live together as brothers, as family, or perish together as fools." And I think the work of the UNESCO chair will be very important in moving this forward, in learning how to live together.